Welcome back, everybody. My name is Paul, and I'm a practicing realtor in the western part of Virginia near Lexington. And one of my favorite subjects is homesteading. I have a specialty in the rural types of properties, and I've grown up around farms. Not necessarily, I didn't practice farming myself, but I've been around basically rural properties in different ways for a long time in many parts of this country, including Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and a little bit of Ohio and Virginia and so on. And homesteading is a very, very common and practical way of living. It's been around for thousands of years. And what I mean by homesteading is just having some measure of self-reliance on your land. Maybe you produce some food. Maybe you have some domestic animals. Maybe you have a craft or an operation going on there to support yourself, to bring in some income. Maybe you have some cows or some chickens or something. But you have, instead of just having a home, you have a property that's functioning and maybe producing some income and certainly producing some of the resources you need for your family and your livelihood. And it's a great way for raising children to have them exposed to the nature and so on, and that's why I'm a big fan of it. And today I'm going to talk a little more about very, very small scale homesteading, because I want to encourage people to just try to get into it. I have young children, my two children in the 30s, they're two boys, and my daughter, she lives in more of a suburb type, but my two boys really love the homesteading type of lifestyle. So it's a very, very common thing. I'm seeing a lot more of that now. People are moving out of the cities. We can use the internet. We can use technology to work, or we can get in our cars and get on a highway and drive to a job, but we can still live in an area that doesn't have to be in a cul-de-sac where it's just you drive down this whole gateway thing and you come to the end where there's a little turnaround thing and then there's a bunch of houses there and that's it, with a yard. The real way of living homestead ways is having some acreage around you, and I suggest having at least 2 acres to call it a real homestead, because your home's going to need a little yard around it and so on, some space, and there'll be some insulation. They use some of the space for trees and so on, maybe some space for a garden, maybe space for a shed or a garage or something. So have sufficient land in your homesteading operation that you can really build and grow into it. So I have a few books I'm going to recommend here today, just real quickly here, that relate to homesteading. Earth ponds. A lot of people talk about ponds. I have a little video I made. I'll make another one about ponds. A pond is a very, very useful thing. In the old days, very common for a farmer to have what they call a fire pond, because back then they didn't have the big electric and water all the way out to the countryside. So if you had something to protect, like a barn with hay in it, you wanted to have a pond there, so when the fire trucks came, they could just throw the hose in there and pump it out and use that. So fire ponds also, ponds were used for cattle. All animals, domestic animals, need a place to drink, so making a pond is a very, very useful thing to do. Many of them are made in springs. You make a little dam and then you catch the water coming down from a spring. But nowadays there's some regulations and so on, and you just got to be careful about designing a pond, because you don't want to make it too big and then have it collapse and then downriver, you got a mess. So basically, a pond. This is some book about how to make them and so on. Shed working, I'll get into that. Sheds are really, really a useful structure on a property, because they can be made in so many ways. And here's a perfect example. There's elegant sheds, attractive sheds, there's temporary sheds, there's prefab sheds that you can make. And you can make, if you have a property with a shed on it, that's a good thing. And if you have one that's really artistic and useful and maybe has a craft room in there or some kind of an office space or something, bonus. Tool shed, yes. So a shed, get one. Earth sheltered housing, there's a lot about that. You have some situations here, for example, where one thing you got to be cautious of, and I had a house last year I sold that had the back of the house was up like this, and you got to be careful about water seeping down in there and coming in against the foundation wall. Even if it's cinder block or concrete, it can still kind of seep in there after a while, and roots. So when you build an earth sheltered situation house, you want to have some kind of effective draining, so whatever water does come down in that area, it gets drained away from the foundation. American Farm, beautiful, beautiful book. Without farms, we got no food. America was founded on farms. Most parts of the world, you got a farm. If you have land, you better have a farm, because you, in most parts of the world, many parts of the world, right today, you live near your food, and that's a really great thing. So farming. Now today I'm going to talk a little about more about getting into homesteading on a really small scale. See, a lot of people, young people, they don't have much money and so on, and it's hard to really decide what to do, because you look on YouTube and you see all these beautiful homesteads, and maybe some family money, or they have a great job or whatever, and they have like 100 acres and they're building a barn, they got a big tractor, and I watched a lot of those videos myself. Like, wow, that's a pretty good tractor. I don't have 100 acres myself even. But you can start really small, and that's how the pioneers did it. That's how the natives did it. In their old days, the native people in native parts of the world, including America, they had to find a little place to live, make a little house. They make a structure that they can easily make and will last a long time. Now, there are places in the world where if you're living near a flood zone, you make it easy to make house, and you may get destroyed really quickly if the river rises or something, but you just build another one. Or in some cases, they actually have huts that, they sort of like a tiki hut that you could just kind of move out of the way until the rainstorms come. So there's a lot of ways of dealing with that kind of situation if you have a really basic structure. But basically, when you get a piece of land, you want to have at least a couple acres, and you want to start making a place for a home site. Now, there's a lot of different things that I can suggest in different of my videos, and I'll just throw them out there, little tips. Part of it is just how you use space, your conception of how space is, because there are people who live in these giant homes, and I've seen many of them. You can walk in there like, wow, like how many people live in this huge house? And it's like 4. Oh, well, I could hold like 50. But it's the way that people use space is they feel that they have to have so much space. But if you think about it, you don't need a lot of space, especially when you're young. And when I was young, I lived in a room sometimes where I had like an efficiency apartment. I think one of my first apartments was like, it had a bedroom, and then had like a little common area, and then a eat-in kitchen kind of thing, and that was it, the whole apartment. I think it was $90 a month. So you can live comfortably, dry, and so on, without having a very sophisticated, expensive structure. It doesn't necessarily need to be big, but you got to figure out how you're going to use your space. And I'll give you an example here. I lived on a property one time, and we got this shed. There's a whole other subject. You can get these fantastic sheds that just drop them on your property. If you're clever with the use of those sheds, the prefab sheds, you get the right kind of design, and maybe a couple of them, and you put them in a good location, you can, if it's a warm climate, reasonably warm climate, you can make a pretty good use out of a shed, a 12 by 15 shed or something. I mean, you can use the extra space upstairs, up in the eaves there. You can put shelves up there like I did in one of mine, and you can have a little patio around it. You can have a side thing off the side where you can, like like a shed basically, you park your belongings under. You can take the eave of a shed, for example. You get one high enough, you drop the eave down, and it has a little shelter there, maybe behind or the side of the shed, where you can put some stuff. So you can make use of a shed. I mean, honestly, if it was just a cabin, in the old days, people used to make these cabins. They'd go buy some piece of land on a lake somewhere, a little couple of acres or whatever, and they plop their little mobile home there. Or basically, a lot of times, they just built a little shed. I found a real shed one time on one of the properties I sold a couple of years ago. Someone had built this really cool long shed long time ago. It was not just a shed, it was a cabin. And I went to look at it, and it was all grown over in there, and I peeked in there, and like, well, there's a faucet in there. What house? I don't think there's a well here. So I looked around, no, there's no well, but I looked around, they had like there was a spring on the property. It came right off the hillside, and there was a little collection thing. It was still filled with water, and they had designed a little system that was only about 50 feet run of hose, and they had a couple valves there, and you could turn on the pump and pump the water in. Next thing you know, you got running water in your cottage just with a little spring 50 feet from your house. So there's things you can do that are very simple, like the old natives and primitives did. They had water collection systems, still very common in parts of the world today, simple water collection systems. You can get these barrels very cheap. I have one right now I use. It collects a lot of water. You get a good rainstorm, fill up 100 gallons of water. And you can use that for your irrigation, you can run it through a filter, you can use it for all kinds of things on your property. Irrigating your crops or just, your garden or so on, your pets. So Very, very simple elemental things that you can do in a property. Clearing a little bit of land, using some of the sticks and twigs to build a fence, build a little pen. Once you have a piece of land that has a little bit of fence on it, a little bit of structure, maybe a shed, you can build these primitive huts, and even sometimes you can get some tin roof. You use some of these 6x6, or you'll get a diameter of a little tree you want to clear, maybe 6 feet, 6 inches around or something, 8 inches. You cut them down, you make a nice little shed on it, you get some tin from the hardware store, you throw a nice roof on there. Next thing you go, got a water collection system and a shed and a structure, and you can go from there. So a lot of different ideas. Now, the way to make a primitive camping site is very, very common. If you ever camped, I've done a lot of that myself. You pull in there, maybe with your kids, and you put up the tent and everything. And a lot of these places have a little fire pit. You can make a nice little fire pit. There's so many beautiful little fire pits that you can find online. You can build them with rocks that you find on your own property. You can build them with different kinds of molded concrete and things like that, or cinder blocks, and you can have a really nice fire pit. So you have a house, you have a structure, maybe it's a primitive shed, or maybe it's a built-in shed or whatever. Just throw it on your property and make it comfortable inside, and you got a roof, and you got a water collection system, and then you have a fire pit. You can cook. So you got to think really creatively. I have a sense of humor about it, but I see so many examples when I visit homesteads in Virginia. There's so many primitive, so-called primitive homesteads. They're little farms. Some of them are older, older houses. And you see the old spring house. You see where they used to put the milk. Sometimes by the stream, they used to build a little place where they keep the milk cold. The guy would deliver the milk in these bottles, and they'd throw it in a little shed underneath down by the water or by the spring or someone. And very, very simple, beautiful ways of living on a property. Collecting water, coming down a ravine, directing it out to your garden, making a little pond. If you make a little pond, it doesn't nearly have to be a big one. A lot of people think, well, I got to make this huge pond, I got to bring in the excavator. No, you don't. You can have a 10-foot by 10-foot pond. It'll attract frogs and wildlife and deer and birds and everything. So it doesn't have to be huge. And later on, if you want to make a larger pond and you make a small decorative pond, well, later on that little pond that you made in the beginning can become part of a landscaping feature on a house when you have built into it later. But in the beginning, you start small and you grow into it. Trees. Trees are a wonderful resource on a property. A lot of times when you get the cheapest type of property, you're going to find some raw land. It's called raw land. Okay, it's going to be cheap. It might be very, very cheap. And as long as you have access, it could be a gravel road, and you get in there, you start clearing the little trees. There are a lot of beautiful trees on the property that you want to keep. You walk in there, look around, find what kind of trees you have, and say, look, let's say you have a whole bunch of nice hardwoods, and they're too close together. Leave some room for them. Harvest the ones that are 6 inches or 8 inches or whatever. It's certainly under 3 inches. Get them all down. Let the undergrowth go up, and let the canopy build, and the trees get bigger. And then sometimes you can save a certain kind of tree on your property, and many, many years later it becomes a whole feature of the property. Because after you live in a property for 30 years, that's a pretty big tree. Fruit trees. You can immediately improve a property by just getting some fruit trees. If you have nut trees on your property, plant some of them. Harvest the seeds. I found a property last year a friend of mine bought, had some American chestnut trees on it, the original ones that evaded the blight. They had a pouring chestnuts in October, falling chestnuts, and harvested a bunch of them. Now she's going to plant a bunch of them and start growing some more chestnut trees, because they started to dwindle in the Northeast for a long time, the American chestnut tree. And those are the kind of chestnuts you buy at Christmas time for like $5-6 a pound. So if like 100 pounds falls off your tree, that's a pretty good deal. So again, homesteading. A platform, a structure, if you clear a little place for a tent space, make sure there's some drainage around it. Make sure there's a little bit of a perimeter, because there's a fire hazard and things like leaves, and especially pine needles. You can find them, and you might have them on your property. And if you do clear a place for your camping, make sure that you kind of sweep it down and get it down to dry ground, because you don't want to have a lot of loose leaves on there where sparks around your fire pit happen, and you could start a real problem. But again, that was the old way, and you build a nice little place for a campsite with a little fire pit, and then you have a shed on your property. you can bring in a lot of these newer trailers, little pop-up trailers, little things that people know about, little camping trailers. You bring them in there and you have a nice comfortable bed. You can throw on a little battery electricity and an inverter, and you have a little household there. And so I encourage people to think creatively. The biggest step is trying to get your land. I made some videos about how to get land and what to look for. If you can get reasonably priced land that you can improve with your sweat equity. And if you can buy a little used tractor or something, or get some farm machinery, talk to your friends, maybe come up with some money, get at least some tools to start working your property to immediately start making a little homestead. And I really encourage this because the real estate business, you know that there's so many of these cookie cutter developments, okay? I'm hoping there's a whole new generation of younger people who go out and make these beautiful little homesteads like Virginia has so many of them, but start a whole bunch of new ones and make them really unique and put domes on them, put yurts on them, and put platforms on them, and start using a blend of the technology and water filtration and so on to do the old style homesteading in a kind of a new way. So I appreciate people watching. Please like and share. And I love the ideas. I watch a lot of other people's content, and I really appreciate all the hard work that people are putting into homesteading because we really need it. We really, really need it. That's why one of the reasons I'm in this business and one of the reasons I make these videos. We need homesteaders, and we need places for children to grow up in a really nice way and enjoy the nature. So thanks again for listening.